Forget New Year, New You. This season is about slowing down, locking the doors, and cozying up at home with the one you really want to do nothing with. Your dog. After the holiday chaos, those quiet nights with a blanket, a podcast, and your pup feel like the reset you actually need. Ollie helps make those moments easier with fresh protein-packed meals made from real human-grade ingredients, so your dog can enjoy some quality comfort food too. Choose from 5 recipes and get a personalized plan for your dog's needs. Meals arrive perfectly proportioned with a scoop and storage container, so serving is fast and mess-free. And with Ollie's in-app on-demand health screenings, supporting your dog is easy, ensuring more cuddles for many years to come. Visit ollie.com/truecrime and use code TRUECRIME for 60% off your first box.
42-year-old Michelle Mockbee was brutally murdered early one morning in May 2012. She had just arrived at her job as an HR employee at Thermo Fisher Scientific, a Northern Kentucky plant. A supervisor named Ed and a janitor stumbled onto the horrific scene. Michelle had been beaten, her wrists cut, her skull fractured, a plastic bag around her head.
Yes, ma'am. I'm calling from Thermo Fisher Scientific, and I just walked in her office, and I think somebody had killed somebody upstairs in her office.
Okay. What makes you think somebody killed somebody?
She's laying there on the ground, covered up, and there's blood all over up the floor in the office.
Okay, and you said there's blood outside the office door?
Yes, ma'am. A big pile of blood.
Ed's voice trembled on the phone with the 911 dispatcher. She urged him to send the janitor to block off the path so nobody would disturb what was clearly a crime scene.
Okay. And that's the janitor that went upstairs with you?
Yes.
And he's the one that's at the steps down, not letting anyone go upstairs?
Yes, ma'am.
The janitor's name was David Dooley. As the police investigation continued and authorities searched for a motive to understand why someone would kill Michelle, David Dooley would become the main suspect. He was arrested and charged with her death, a jury convicting him in 2014 and sentencing him to life in prison. But this isn't a straightforward, open and shut case by any means. In 2016, roughly 2 years after David's conviction, a whistleblower, a clerk who had been fired from prosecutor Linda Talley-Smith's office, gave the Attorney General a thumb drive with some damaging information on it, according to local media reports. The messages on the thumb drive made it clear that the lead detective in Michelle Mockbee's case, Detective Bruce McVeigh, and prosecutor Linda Talley-Smith had been having an affair. Under oath, Talley-Smith admitted that they had started an affair after David's trial had ended. David Dooley's defense team said the thumb drive also contained proof that the prosecution had been deceptive and hadn't released all the information in the case to the defense. What was kept hidden from them? According to local media reports, the defense said a surveillance video they hadn't seen before captured an unknown man walking through the parking lot and approaching a door behind a nearby building the night before Michelle was murdered. The defense argued David deserved a retrial. Judge James R. Schrand, who presided over the first trial, granted that request in 2017. And that's where today's episode brings us, to David Dooley's retrial. Will he be convicted again, or will there be new evidence that proves his innocence? This is Jillian, and you are listening to Court Junkie, episode 142. David Dooley's retrial started in February 2019. For David, it was another chance to defend himself against the prosecution's theory of the case. For Michelle's family, they feared Michelle's killer would walk free after they had watched him be convicted in 2014. Family members told local media outlets they were convinced David was guilty. In the first trial, the defense had argued that there was a lack of evidence against their client. But now they were going to be arguing something else in addition to that. They were going to point their fingers at other suspects. More on that in just a bit. But first, Prosecutor John Heck with the Kentucky Attorney General's office started his opening statements by describing the scene on May 29, 2012. Michelle had gone into work earlier than normal at 5:50 a.m. because she handled payroll for Thermo Fisher Scientific, a multi-billion-dollar company that manufactures equipment and technology for scientists. It was a massive site, multiple warehouses the size of football fields. But on this early morning when Michelle arrived, less than 10 people were already at work. Michelle was almost alone. Michelle walked up the steps to her second-story office. Her office mates wouldn't arrive for another hour. Heck said she normally locked her office because someone once tried to break in.
She never had an opportunity to unlock that door. What we estimate to be about 6 to 6:01 a.m., she was beaten. She was beaten badly. We believe the attack started here, this first pool of blood right here. She was beaten. Her hands were bound behind her back with packaging tape. A plastic bag was taken over her head, a plastic bag that we believe was taken from the women's room. Go ahead, Jeff. Right here. See the pool here? Plastic bag was taken out of this, placed over her head. She was then drugged about 40 feet, pooling blood all the way to this door. This door leads to what's called the mezzanine area. Jeff. She was taken through this door, taken to the right, and laid to rest on a filthy warehouse floor where the only thing she could do was die.
Ed Yuska, a supervisor who later called 911, noticed the pool of blood that stained the second floor by Michelle's office and alerted the head of maintenance, David Dooley, who out loud assumed it was just grease. David also said it wasn't there earlier that morning when he cleaned that floor.
Cleaning services for this warehouse was done by the defendant, David Dooley, and his wife. They were not employees of Thermo Fisher Scientific. They were contractors. They used those punch cards I was telling you about earlier, okay? On this particular day, David Dooley arrived at 5 a.m., so about an hour before Michelle. And that's not unusual, okay? He would usually get there, clean up the break room, offices, and move his way out to the warehouse. So when the defendant is called up, he says, well, that wasn't there this morning when he cleaned. I want you to focus on what I just said. It wasn't there this morning when he cleaned. You're going to hear evidence during the course of this trial. This place hadn't been cleaned yet. Rather, we think Mr. Dooley was doing something else.
Heck said the two men began looking around. Ed found Michelle, and it was very clear that she was deceased.
Police arrive, and they tell everyone, go ahead, Jeff, to get to this lobby area. All the employees to the lobby, all right? They question them, they inspect them, they look at their clothes, they're looking for blood, they're looking for defensive wounds, offensive wounds. They take pictures of the bottoms of their feet. Perhaps most importantly, they tell everyone, what did you do today? Walk me through this day. And everyone's like, it's just a normal day. I'm parking my same spot. You're going to learn these people. Many of them have been there for 30 years. The average tenure there is like 22 years. People love working there. And they are creatures of habit. And they say, I did the same thing I do every morning. I parked in my same spot. I sat in my car, drank my coffee. I went in through the man door. And I started working. You'll hear that they have these, what they're called RF guns, that they scan the inventory. So as inventory comes in, they scan it, goes on shelves. As it goes out, it gets scanned. It really is a well-run machine. And these people have been there for years. And they all just recount their day. David Dooley recounted his day. He cleaned here, he cleaned there, he was out the warehouse. Okay. He appeared clean and neat.
Heck then outlined the evidence against David Dooley. The surveillance video from an adjacent facility showed the comings and goings of a normal morning, except for one thing. Shortly after Michelle was murdered, David could be seen leaving the plant. And not only was he leaving, but he took a different route than he usually did.
About 30 minutes after Michelle's death, about 6:30 in the morning, guess who's seen leaving? David Dooley. And he's not just leaving. He parks here. He should go out here. That's the way he goes. We looked at a month of surveillance. He goes in and out this way every single time. It was 6:30 in the morning, 30 minutes after Michelle Mockbee had been beaten to death. He gets in his truck and he goes all the way around here. Think he didn't want to be seen?
Whoever murdered Michelle presumably left the warehouse, Heck said, since police never found the murder weapon or other items used in the attack. This was a central part of the criminal case against David.
The police reached this conclusion. And ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case is going to be, I think you're going to be satisfied. Whoever did this left. Items that were used in Michelle's murder to this day have never been found at that warehouse. Items like the tape gun that bound her wrists. Items like the blade that cut her wrists, which I forgot to mention. Her wrists were cut. Her skull was fractured. Some blunt object was used to beat her to death. These items were never recovered. They go to Mr. Dooley's house, and he confirms, oh yeah, I did leave. Why did you leave? My wife wasn't feeling well. Okay. They go back to Thermo Fisher and they interview some of the other employees. Did you see David Dooley leave? Was one of the questions that was asked. One of the guys who unloads the trucks first thing in the morning, his name is a guy named Joe Seeger. Joe Seeger said, yeah, he did leave because I saw him when he came back. And it was kind of weird because he never talks to me, but he made it a point. He came up, he walked up to my car and said, went home because I ripped my pants. Okay, so if you're keeping track, in the first interview, David Dooley makes no mention that he went home. When there's undisputed proof that he left, he acknowledges, oh yeah, I did leave. To a coworker, oh no, and I went home because my wife wasn't feeling well. And to a coworker, he went home because he ripped his pants. We're up to 3.
What made the case a complex one for the prosecution, however, was the lack of forensic evidence. No conclusive DNA or fingerprints. In his opening statements, Heck admitted this, but he believed there was a likely explanation. As a janitor, David had access to latex gloves and wore them when he cleaned. In the dust of the warehouse, investigators hunted for prints. They searched the walls outside Michelle's office where she had been attacked. They swabbed and swabbed, Heck said, trying to get DNA evidence. Finally, he said they did get something. Heck told the jury that Michelle had been dragged down a 40-foot hallway.
When you drag someone, it allows trace DNA to get all over them. Skin cells contain DNA. Hair contains DNA. It gets embedded in carpet. And when someone is drugged, particularly with the force of the weight of their body being drugged against the carpet, there's going to be lots of DNA profiles. On Michelle's shirt alone, there were several DNA profiles. We never could identify all of them. Her husband's DNA was on her shirt. Her DNA was on her shirt. And a profile from which he can't be excluded was also found on her shirt. It's not a strong match. I don't want to oversell the DNA to you. Okay? About 1 in 8 people have the profile that was found, and he's one of them. But the trash bag that was on her head, a much stronger match to David Dooley. So there will be DNA evidence in this case.
Although he conceded that the DNA found on her shirt that couldn't exclude David wasn't that strong a match, he said a trash bag that was on her head was a much stronger one. The photos of employee time cards flashed on a screen in front of the jury. This was what the prosecution believed was the motive for the crime: fraud and money.
These are the time cards. This is what the Temps use. This is what the Dooleys use. Let me tell you a little bit about their arrangement. Janet Dooley was given a salary, $1,200 or $1,400 a month, to clean the break room and the offices. David punched in and was paid hourly to clean the warehouse. If and only if Janet helped in the warehouse could she punch in. But here's what they were doing. Dave would get to work with no Janet, punch them both in, and then do her job while they're both on the clock.
It was called triple dipping, Heck said, where David and his wife, Janet, were getting paid a salary and then 2 hourly wages because David would punch in as though Janet was helping clean the warehouse, too. 4 days before Michelle's death, Heck said David and Janet did just that. David clocked in at 4:49 a.m. Then Janet's time card was punched at 5:56 a.m., although she didn't physically arrive at work until 7:30 a.m.
So here's what's happening. Janet Dooley's being paid for not being there. David Dooley's being paid to do Janet's job, and they're getting a salary. Why is this important? Michelle Mockbee is the human resources officer for this facility. She checked payroll, and she was doing payroll that morning. When she showed up, she would have gathered the time cards and looked at them and said, there's Dave, there's Janet. There's Dave doing Janet's job. There's no Janet. Yet again, Janet's not here. We think this very well could be the impetus for the assault. The Dooleys were busted.
Further, Heck said the time cards for Janet and David from that morning were missing.
To give a little bit of credence to this, wouldn't it help to know if we had that punch card from Janet punched in that day and the punch card from Dave punched in, showing them both punched in? You'd like to have that, wouldn't you? Guess what? It was never found. To this day, it's never been found. It wasn't in Michelle's stuff when she gathered up the time cards. It wasn't in the time card slot that I showed you, that second slot. It wasn't in David Dooley's janitor closet. And it wasn't found in his house. The punch cards that would show they were working that day went missing. We believe the killer realized, this is why I killed her. I need to take this evidence with me. I need to take the razor blade that I cut her wrist with. I need to take the tape gun that I bound her hands with, and I need to get out of here. And those items were never found.
Remember how Prosecutor Heck said that Michelle kept her office door locked because somebody tried to break in before? That played into the evidence too, he said. A few months earlier, there were marks left at her door. And then fresh pry marks that came from a screwdriver appeared just a few days earlier at Michelle's door. Investigators were able to take impressions from the marks.
So we see this wedge mark. It's about 9/10 of a centimeter wide. It is the head of a flathead screwdriver, but not just any flathead screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver that has grooves, a prime type screwdriver. Okay? Go ahead. This is David Dooley's janitor's closet. When they searched his closet, they found a screwdriver. Not in a toolbox, not in a drawer, up in a cupboard with a knife, not in a toolbox, behind the stack of urinal cakes. Suspicious? You bet.
Heck then said he had a couple other things he wanted to touch on, one of them being Michelle's husband, Dan Mockbee.
Dan Mockbee, Michelle's husband, they, by all accounts, had a loving, caring relationship. There's no history of domestic violence, okay? But he was looked at, as you would. Michelle Mockbee wasn't in a gang. She wasn't a drug dealer. So you start looking at, all right, does she have a husband? Because that's our first suspect. Dan Mockbee was vetted, okay? He was looked at. Dan Mockbee worked at Thermo Fisher Scientific with Michelle as a supervisor. That's where they met. This place was like a family. He was off work that day. I mentioned they had 2 little girls. He was going to spend time with the girls for a few days. He was at home. He's getting phone calls from some of his employees who can't get to work because the police have blocked off the driveway. So he's like, well, what's going on? And he's calling and texting his wife, hey, baby, you okay? Phone call after phone call is not being answered. He gets in his car and he drives there. And he's told that his wife's been murdered. And he acted appropriately. He was absolutely distraught. Signed every consent form that was thrown in front of him. Search my house, search my computers, search me, search my van. He acted very appropriately.
Michelle and Dan, who also worked at Thermo Fisher Scientific, were the parents of 2 daughters. It was clear Michelle loved being a mom. On her Facebook page, she shared photographs of the girls posing with a Disney princess and Mickey Mouse on a family vacation. "What was I thinking?" Michelle wrote with a question mark and an exclamation point on Christmas Day 2011, next to a picture of her 2 children proudly clutching guitars by the Christmas tree. It looked like a happy family on the outside, though there were what some might consider red flags in Michelle and Dan's relationship, that not everything was so perfect. For example, the couple was deep in debt. They owed on their credit cards. They clearly weren't great managing their money. And with Michelle's death, Heck said Dan stood to financially benefit considerably, collecting more than $700,000 in life insurance. But as the police investigation went on, which meant taking a deeper look at everyone at the warehouse, Heck pointed out that one employee's behavior stood out. David, the janitor, who seemed fidgety and nervous under questioning. As the prosecution's opening statements were coming to an end, Heck seemed to be preparing for the rebuttal that would be coming from the defense. Already, the case had been flawed with an inappropriate relationship between a detective and the previous prosecutor. There were also the accusations of not having disclosed all the evidence. But there was also more. A detective used a handheld recorder that wasn't working properly when he interviewed witnesses. With the faulty equipment, he turned to old-fashioned paper and pen to take notes. And there was more.
I don't know if it's so much of a mistake of law enforcement so much as it is a failure of equipment. So it goes. But there is a mistake that was made that I think, and I know that the Boone County Sheriff's Office will accept. I mentioned that Michelle had a bag around her head. It became saturated with blood. And when things become saturated with blood, it makes it more difficult to extract someone else's DNA because there's so much DNA in blood and there's so much blood in that bag. So what they did is they cut around the portions that they're like, this is the best part of the bag that we can test. They took 2 large pieces of the bag, but where there was the mass amount of pooling of blood, where they didn't think they could get that much DNA, they did not test. They did not collect. They did not test it. And they will be the first to admit, even if we didn't test it, we should have collected it. Okay? That was missed. That was a mistake that they made.
But Heck insisted they had the right guy. Only one person left the warehouse that day and then returned, which would have given him the opportunity to hide the murder weapon, the time cards, and any other evidence. Only one person had the motive, a motive that was timeless, old-fashioned greed and fraud. Every arrow points to David Dooley, Heck said, asking the jury to convict him of murder and tampering with physical evidence.
Items used in the murder of Michelle Mockbee were taken from the scene and never recovered. Whoever did it would have had blood on them, on their clothes, and on their boots, and they had to change and come back. Only one person left, and that's David Dooley.
Next up was defense attorney Deanna Dennison, who immediately insisted that David didn't murder Michelle. The prosecution's motive didn't make sense, she argued. It was impossible for David to ever truly get rid of the time cards because the company copied them and sent them to the corporate office. Somebody else had a better motive and would gain something from Michelle's death, she said. That person also knew the exact details of Michelle's schedule and when she left for work, since she was coming in earlier than normal to handle her payroll duties. It was her husband, she said. She told the jury that Dan Mockbee would end up receiving a significant sum in the $1 million range from all the payments collected after Michelle's death.
Who has the most to gain? Let's talk about that. It's not just, I'll tell you, the benefits that he would gain and did gain as a result of her death. We've got life insurance, $774,000 in life insurance. We've got another life insurance policy, Stonebridge, $30,000. We've got $10,000 from Wachovia. We've got $4,000 from Hartford Life. We've got $76,000 from workers' comp benefits. that if you die at work, you get more.
Before Michelle died, the family was in debt $65,000. Creditors were calling. She had been sued, Dennison said. It seemed to be piling up. Shortly before the murder, Dan took money from his 401k to pay bills and to get caught up on the mortgage. And after Michelle's death, Dan took out huge cash withdrawals, more than $390,000 in cash, she said. She said Dan couldn't account for all the money he took out. Did that mean he hired somebody to kill Michelle? Dennison said there was more suspicious behavior. At the exact same time, Dan was notified at 8:09 a.m. that something had happened at his work. He deleted files on his computer.
We also checked his computer and ran a program on his computer. And at exactly the time, and he testifies it, he tells the officers, yeah, this guy called me and told me that the police were there. They were blocking the entrance, and you can't get in. Also differing statements about whether he said that there was a body. But at 8:09, the exact time, right after the guy gets off the phone call, 8:09, he was in a program on his computer. It's called Cypher, scrubbing his deleted files from his computer.
She said Dan had been looking at dating websites. She also responded to the prosecutor's statements about how David changed his story about why he left the factory that morning. It had started out as a normal day on the job for David, who had been employed at the warehouse for several years. He didn't see any blood when he went up to the second-floor office. He went about his business cleaning the bathrooms and doing inventory control. His wife had a busy day of work ahead of her and wasn't feeling well, but when he tried calling her, she didn't answer. That's why, she said, he went back home to check on her. He went home, saw his wife, and left again. He got back to work around 7 a.m. so he could discover a dead body, she asked. It doesn't make sense. So the prosecution is adamant that David Dooley committed the murder, although they admit that their case isn't as strong as they'd like it to be. Meanwhile, the defense says Michelle's husband is more likely the killer. The question is, would that be enough reasonable doubt for the jury this time around? Just a note before I continue on with David Dooley's trial. Law and Crime live-streamed the opening statements and some of the testimony from the detectives who testified for the prosecution. However, after a couple days of testimony, the judge suddenly ordered the live streaming to stop. No reason was given, but as a result, there's only limited audio from the beginning of the trial. Many of the following details come from local news reports. After opening statements, witness testimony began, including from Michelle's widowed husband, Dan Mockbee. Dan insisted that he had nothing to do with his wife's murder. According to WCPO, Dan testified that he did receive a lot of money after Michelle's death, and that he lost at least 10% of it in business ventures that didn't work out. He said he also gave some of the money to his nephew and to, of course, his 2 daughters with Michelle, saying, "We had this money and the girls had just lost their mother and I'm trying. I don't want the girls to go into a dark place." On cross, he also said he still owes more than $1,000 for Michelle's headstone. All that cash withdrawal and you haven't yet paid for her headstone? Dennison asked. Dan said no. Dan was also questioned about a $10,000 check he made out to a friend, Chris Black, a few months after Michelle's death. Chris also worked at Thermo Fisher Scientific. According to local media outlets, Dan testified that he couldn't remember why he had written that check. Chris and his wife, Marta, testified they were in financial hard times. Marta said she had asked Dan for the money. "That's what friends do for one another. They help each other out," she said, according to the Cincinnati Enquirer. The defense questioned both Dan and Chris. implying that Dan had paid his friend to murder Michelle. Now you say you didn't kill your wife, but did you have anything to do with hiring somebody to kill your wife? David's attorney asked Dan. Absolutely not. Absolutely not, Dan replied. Do you agree with me that this is a pretty good motive or incentive to kill your wife? David's attorney asked. No, Dan said. As for Chris, the defense asked him straight out if he had anything to do with Michelle's murder. No, sir, Chris replied. The planning of it? No, sir. The execution of it? No, sir. WCPO, an ABC affiliate out of Cincinnati, also covered the trial, as detectives working the case took the stand for hours at a time. Boone County Sheriff's Office Detective Bruce McVeigh retired after David's first trial, after he had been caught having an affair with the prosecutor. For the retrial, he returned to court and testified that during his investigation, he paid close attention to any signs that the plant employees may have been involved in a struggle. Drops of blood, torn clothes, anything. WCPO detailed McVeigh's testimony as he described how David Dooley stood out. He had clean white shoes and the place was filthy, so that was an observation to me, he said. He wasn't alone. One of David's co-workers also testified how strange it was that David's shoes looked so clean that morning. Detective McVeigh also testified that something else seemed off. When he interviewed David the first time, David said he collected the garbage that morning, but officials noticed the work hadn't yet been done. David also didn't initially disclose that he had abruptly left work that morning. It took another interview for David to admit that and be more forthcoming. David finally told detectives he had gone home to check on his wife. He said he was worried about her, which is why he went home in the first place, because she didn't pick up her phone. He described his sequence of events: going home, seeing his wife on the couch, kissing her, playing with their cat, and then returning to work, according to the Cincinnati Enquirer. But his wife had a different version of events, Detective McVeigh said. David never returned home. David seemed shocked as detectives confronted him about this under questioning. You can ask her, David said. We did, Detective McVeigh replied. And she said I didn't come home? That's not right. I did, David said. The recorded interview played at trial, according to local media reports. Why would her story be different? Detective McVeigh asked. She wasn't with me that day, so she doesn't know, David said. But she said you didn't come home, Detective McVeigh insisted. I don't know, David said. She said I didn't come home? Yes. David said his wife had trouble hearing and may not have heard the detective's question correctly, which might explain why she said that. In the interview, David's demeanor seemed to change. Detective Everett Stahl testified about an interrogation tactic they used on him, a ruse. Authorities believed Michelle had been murdered with a tape gun, although, remember, the murder weapon was never confirmed or found. Detectives pulled out a tape gun that was similar to the one they believed had been used and held it up to see how David would react to it. Would he think it was the actual murder weapon? David's demeanor changed quickly and he stopped talking, according to Detective Stahl's testimony on the stand. Detective Brian Cochran detailed the steps of the investigation for the jury and walked them through numerous items of evidence they tested from inside David's janitor's closet. No evidence of any blood was found. The same goes for David's truck. On cross, he said he only used Blue Star on David's truck and in the warehouse, not in Dan Mockbee's car. Detective Cochran said he executed a search warrant on David himself and took photographs of any perceived injuries. There were none found. As for DNA evidence, Michelle's clothing, a bag she had been carrying, and part of a bag that was found wrapped around her head were all tested, but nothing conclusively matched David. The prosecution's expert could only say his profile couldn't be excluded. Dr. Gregory Wanger, the medical examiner who performed Michelle's autopsy, testified that in his opinion, he agreed that the murder weapon was a tape gun. He said there were skull fractures, brain bleeding, and bruising. Numerous employees from Thermo Fisher Scientific also took the stand. One employee recounted that when she returned to work on the day Michelle's body was found, David was downstairs, making sure no one disturbed the crime scene. She said he was distraught and very upset. She said he then suddenly became agitated and was cursing about how he had been asked to monitor the door and staircases to protect the scene. Another employee said David was very fidgety after the body was found, and that when asked what was going on, he just kept saying, "It's Michelle." Yet another employee, however, testified on cross that he saw a white van that seemed to be out of place outside the facility on the morning of the murder. He said most of the workers know each other and know what cars they drive. This van was one he hadn't seen before. When it was the defense's turn to present their case, they offered up additional suspects, ones they say investigators never truly followed up on. One of them was Michelle's husband, Dan, something the defense straight away came out and said during their opening statements. They called a computer expert named Andrew Garrett to the stand. Garrett testified that he examined the computers at the Mockbee home, as well as Michelle's computer at work. What he found? Lots of dating sites on the Mockbee's home computer. Sites like Fling.com and Adult Friend Finder. He said a dating website was also accessed from Michelle's work computer in March 2012, about 2 months prior to her death. According to the Northern Kentucky Tribune, Garrett also testified that the computer program Cipher was accessed on the Mockbee's home computer at 8:09 a.m., right around the time Dan had been notified that something had happened at their work. Cipher is a program that destroys files so they can't be recovered. Now, the prosecution had called their own expert who testified that the program was initiated automatically when the computer booted up that morning, but Garrett said that wasn't possible. The defense also pointed to another potential suspect, a man named Joe, who was a warehouse worker at Thermo Fisher Scientific. Joe had testified for the prosecution and said he saw Michelle as she clocked in the morning she died. He said she seemed like she was in a hurry. Joe said he also saw David that morning at about 7 a.m. According to his testimony, David told him that he had to go home and change his pants because he had ripped them. Garrett testified that the interviews police did with both David, his first interview, and with Joe had been erased. Prosecutors say that the tape recorder that was used in those particular interviews had malfunctioned, but according to Garrett, it may have been intentional. A security guard from Thermo Fisher Scientific also testified about Joe. He said Joe told him that if people knew what he did about what happened, quote, it would scare the fuck out of them. Joe told him that if it was him, he would have worn gloves and a suit, and that when the DNA results come back, they would blow people away. The security guard said he was so freaked out by the comments that he told his boss about it. He said a few others talked about the murder, but none as much as Joe did. Joe talked about it every day, he said. He wanted to know a lot of stuff. The defense also called a man named Garland Latham, who used to work at the warehouse. Remember that surveillance video that the defense said the prosecution held back from them during the first trial? Well, now was their chance to show it to the jury. The video showed a man, whose identity was never confirmed, walking through the warehouse parking lot about 9 hours before the murder. Latham was asked if anyone had ever asked if he could identify the man, and he said no, that it's the first time he has ever seen it. A hearing specialist was also called to the stand. According to WKRC, he testified that he administered a hearing test to David's wife, and that she had moderate to severe hearing loss in her left ear, and profound hearing loss in her right ear. As you'll recall, David told detectives that she may not have heard their question correctly when asked if David had come home that morning. And as for a tape gun being the possible murder weapon, the defense called Dr. Richard Haught, a biomechanics engineer and professor, to dispute that. Dr. Haught said that in his opinion, he didn't think the tape gun could have caused Michelle's injuries, that it was well below the amount of force needed to kill someone like that. In her closing arguments, David's attorney, Deanna Dennison, said Michelle deserves to have the right killer prosecuted and that it's not David Dooley. She said there's a mountain of evidence in the case, but it doesn't connect him to the murder. She also pointed out that the force that was used to kill Michelle suggested the killer was in a rage. Instead, she said it could have been another warehouse worker, or Dan Mockbee could have given someone access to the building and then hired that person to kill her. It would be a rage so great to have bludgeoned this woman to death, and they want you to believe it's over a time card? She asked. When it was his turn, Prosecutor Heck showed a photo of Dan Mockbee to the jury and said, "Is he a cold-blooded killer, or is he a devastated husband? He lives with the mother of his murdered wife. He's raising 2 children he had with his murdered wife." The trial concluded in March 2019. For the second time, David waited for the jury to decide his fate. And for a second time, he heard the same verdict. The jury of 4 women and 8 men voted guilty. The following month, court resumed as David waited for his sentence. In an emotional hearing, Michelle's loved ones gave victim impact statements, describing the absence in their lives left by Michelle's death. Michelle's sister, Jennifer Schneider, spoke. "We will never know what truly happened that day," she said, according to the Northern Kentucky Tribune newspaper. "The only people who truly know are David Dooley and my sister, Michelle Mockbee, and only one of them still has a voice. The one who still has a voice, almost 7 years later, continues to be a coward and hide behind his lies." With that, the judge sentenced David to 43 years in prison. He would return to court again in 2020, facing charges over child pornography from a crime unrelated to Michelle's death. In a plea deal in November 2020, David pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 2 5-year terms, according to local media reports. David Dooley will serve that sentence concurrently with his 43-year murder sentence. And that's all for this episode. As always, I'd love to hear what you think about this case. Do you agree with the jury that David murdered Michelle? Or do you buy the defense's argument that there was too much reasonable doubt? Let me know by joining the conversation on Instagram @CourtJunkie, on Twitter @CourtJunkiePod, or you can email me at podcast@courtjunkie.com. This is an episode that I'm going to be discussing on my very first after show episode, which will be dropping on the Court Junkie feed next week. I'd love to hear your comments on the case, so make sure to submit those so you can join in on the discussion. And make sure to subscribe to my channel on YouTube, where I've been posting some behind-the-scenes videos, and I'll be posting the videos from the after show on there as well. That's at youtube.com/courtjunkie. Today's episode was researched and written by Gabrielle Russon. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.